Welcome to the debate. In medicine, there's a fascinating and honestly somewhat tragic phenomenon with organ transplants. You can have this brilliant surgeon, right, insert a perfectly healthy, life-saving organ into a failing body.
Right, but the body's immune system doesn't see a savior, it just sees a foreign invader.
Exactly. It attacks it, it surrounds it, isolates it, and ultimately rejects the very thing it needs to survive. And organizations do the exact same thing to disruptors.
Yeah, they really do.
We call it institutional absorption. And today we are unpacking Dr. Jonathan H. Westover's research to figure out exactly why it happens. His work documents this incredibly common cycle where organizations hire change agents to drive transformation, only to systematically neutralize the reform capacity within, like 6 to 12 months.
It really is the defining tragedy of corporate reform. The system is quite literally built to protect itself from disruption, even when that disruption is exactly what the board of directors ordered.
Right.
We are going to look closely at Dr. Westover's cross-industry analysis today. So from healthcare to government to technology, to explore how these systems absorb disruptive talent without ever making it look like outright sabotage.
Yeah, and the central question we are wrestling with is how to actually stop this from happening. When I look at Westover's data, I see a purely architectural problem. Institutional absorption is fundamentally a structural issue, and it can only be neutralized by changing hard systems, like reward mechanisms and resource control.
And I come at it from a completely different way. While structures matter, obviously, I argue that successful reform depends primarily on the relational and tactical capabilities of the change agent.
Okay.
Specifically, it's about political capital accumulation and network coalition building. You can't just mandate change from a blueprint, You have to navigate the human reality of the organization.
Well, let's lay out the groundwork for why these change agents fail so predictably. When we talk about institutional absorption, we are not talking about a CEO actively trying to fire a new reform-minded executive.
No, it's much more subtle than that.
It is. We're talking about cultural gravity. There's a concept that Jeffrey Pfeiffer and Robert Sutton called the rhetoric-reality gap. The organization's rhetoric is screaming, "We want massive change! We are innovating!"
Sure.
But the organization's reality, its performance horizons, its budget authorities, its promotion criteria, that reality is whispering, "Do exactly what we did yesterday."
Right. It's the gap between what the company says on its glossy website and how middle managers are actually paid.
Precisely. And when an organization hires a change agent, but fails to alter that underlying structural architecture, they're setting a trap. This goes all the way back to Stephen Kerr's foundational 1975 research on the folly of rewarding A while hoping for B.
Oh yeah, a classic text.
Right. The organization claims it wants a disruptor, but the reward system structurally advantages conformity, risk avoidance, and hitting this quarter's metrics. So individual resilience, no matter how heroic or charismatic the change agent is, it simply cannot overcome an organizational machine that fundamentally penalizes disruption.
Yeah.
If your bonus depends on not rocking the boat, you will eventually stop rocking it.
Well, the rhetoric-reality gap is a very real phenomenon. I won't argue that. But structures by themselves are entirely inert without the political networks that bridge them. You can rewrite an org chart. You can draft all the new compensation models you want.
Yeah.
But if the actual human beings in those boxes refuse to cooperate, your structural change is a fiction.
A fiction that can be corrected by better architecture, though.
I just don't think it's that simple. Let's look at Badalana and Cassiaro's 2012 longitudinal study. They tracked change agents across highly regulated complex industries, so like healthcare and finance.
Okay.
And what they found emphatically proved that a change agent's political network position, specifically their informal ties that spans across different organizational boundaries, well, that predicted their success far more strongly than their formal authority or the structural design of their department.
Really?
Yeah. Change isn't driven by an idealized architectural blueprint. It is driven by political capital, it's driven by structured listening, and the ability to overcome what the literature calls hindrance stress.
Hindrance stress.
Right, that debilitating, everyday pressure of navigating conflicting stakeholder demands. You don't survive absorption by rewriting the rule book from day one. You survive it by building a coalition that makes your work indispensable to the people around you.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on where that resistance actually comes from. Because if you rely on coalitions without realigning the fundamental reward systems, your change agents are just putting on a show. They become theatrical performers. Richard Rummelt perfectly termed this strategy theater.
Strategy theater. I like that phrase, but how does it actually manifest?
It manifests as a lot of motion without any actual movement. The change agent holds cross-functional meetings, they build alliances, they publish beautiful vision documents on the company intranet.
And everyone nods in agreement.
Right, everyone nods, but the core operations remain entirely unchanged because the incentives haven't shifted. The legacy manager goes back to their desk and prioritizes the exact same legacy work because that is what their performance review is based on.
Sure. I mean, people do what they're paid to do.
Exactly. Ignoring the underlying architecture is like trying to plant a disruptor seed in institutional concrete and blaming the seed when it doesn't grow. You have to break the concrete.
The concrete is real, absolutely. But you're assuming we have the luxury of a jackhammer on day one.
We have to find one, or the seed dies. Look at the Cleveland Clinic. This is a perfect example from the source material. They wanted a system-wide patient experience transformation. For years, they had the rhetoric.
Yeah.
They brought in change agents, they built the coalitions you're talking about, but the institutional gravity was purely clinical excellence. So mortality statistics, surgical volume, research productivity.
Right.
That is what drove physician recognition and pay.
Which makes sense for a hospital. Structurally, you want good clinical outcomes.
It makes total sense, but it completely marginalized the patient experience. The transformation only actually succeeded when the structural architecture changed. They didn't just ask doctors to join a coalition. They structurally tied physician compensation directly to patient experience scores.
Wow.
Yeah, they modified promotion criteria so that clinical leadership required demonstrated patient-centered innovation. They changed the concrete. They made patient-centeredness a structural career accelerator, and suddenly the whole system transformed.
Well, the Cleveland Clinic is a great example of the end state of a transformation. But I think you are skipping over the timeline. Overhauling physician compensation, changing enterprise-wide promotion criteria. I mean, these things take years to get approved by executive committees and boards in a complex enterprise.
They do take time, yes.
Change agents do not have years. Dr. Westover's research explicitly points out that they face complete absorption within 6 to 12 months. They have to survive the present. And surviving the present requires a coalition infrastructure, not a 5-year compensation overhaul.
So how do you survive the present without the leverage of compensation?
By changing the relational dynamics immediately. Think about Microsoft under Satya Nadella. When he took over, the culture was famously siloed.
Oh yeah, the legendary Microsoft infighting.
Exactly. Divisions were virtually at war with each other, actively sabotaging rival products. Nadella didn't just walk in and instantly change everyone's bonus structure. He mandated that the senior leadership team act as a consensus-driven coalition. He created the Technical Fellows Program.
But hold on. Creating a Technical Fellows Program is a structural intervention.
It has a structural label, I'll give you that, but its mechanism was purely relational. It was designed to bridge the technical and commercial functions through human networks. By elevating these fellows, he built trust equity.
Trust equity.
Right. It allowed change agents deeper in the organization to lean on an established coalition rather than fighting daily resistance alone against entrenched middle managers. The political ties saved the transformation and stopped the infighting long before any architectural reward shifts could fully take root. You have to build a network to survive long enough to change the architecture.
You're arguing that survival requires a network, but let's test that against the actual timeline of a change agent's tenure. If you're listening to this and you've ever been hired to shake things up, you know the trajectory. John Gabarro's longitudinal study points out that the real danger zone for new managers with a change mandate hits right between months 4 and 8.
Yep, the honeymoon phase wears off.
The honeymoon is totally over. The initial enthusiasm crashes into the reality of operational demands. The legacy managers stop smiling in the meetings and start actively ignoring your emails.
Exactly. That valley of implementation is littered with the careers of change agents who thought their mandate letter was a magic shield. It's not.
Which is why my answer to surviving that valley isn't just building better relationships, it's resource control. Hard budget authority. Organizations love to hire, a chief innovation officer or diversity executive.
Right, the flashy titles.
Yes, and they place them in these highly visible staff roles with massive enterprise-wide mandates, but they give them incredibly narrow resource control. It is structural sabotage.
It's certainly a setup for exhaustion, that's for sure.
It's worse than exhaustion. Without a dedicated budget, that change agent is doomed to continuous negotiation. They have to literally beg line managers, who are desperately protecting the status quo, by the way, for the resources to do their job.
Yeah, it's an uphill battle.
If you want to survive the valley, look at Amazon's two-pizza team model. They do not force innovation teams to go cup in hand to legacy business units. They give these teams dedicated transformation budgets, direct hiring authority, and extended timelines without interference. Amazon structurally insulates innovation from institutional gravity by building a wall of autonomy around them. The mechanism of survival is money and structural independence.
Autonomy is great. I mean, a blank check is a compelling argument. But a blank check isn't a shield if the culture punishes you for using it. You can have all the budget in the world, but if the environment fundamentally lacks psychological safety, the reformer will be isolated anyway.
You think so? Even with the budget?
Absolutely. They will experience what Giampiero Petriglieri calls professional identity threat, or worse, moral injury. They eventually just become complicit in the dysfunction because the human cost of fighting the system every day is just too high.
So how does a network solve that? If the legacy managers are blocking you, a network doesn't magically clear the roadblock.
It does if you build a transparency infrastructure. Survival isn't just about cash, it's about making the resistance visible. Look at the U.S. Digital Service and 18F inside the federal government. Talk about institutional gravity. It does not get heavier than legacy federal bureaucracy.
A fair point. I mean, the gravitational pull of government procurement is practically a black hole.
Exactly. And when 18F came in to fix these massive failing federal IT projects, they didn't have massive budget dominance over the legacy departments. They were a tiny fraction of the size.
Right.
What they used was Amy Edmondson's concept of psychological safety and a default to open transparency protocol.
But how does defaulting to open actually stop a legacy manager from crushing a project?
By changing the cost of resistance. When 18F encountered bureaucratic obstacles, they didn't rely on massive structural resource control to bulldoze them. They used visible backlogs.
Visible backlogs, okay.
Yeah, if a legacy manager was stalling on a compliance approval, their refusal wasn't hidden in a private, deniable email chain. It was documented publicly in team retrospectives. It was a glaring red bottleneck on a public dashboard that the entire agency leadership could see.
Oh, wow.
Right. By doing this, they transformed shadowy, passive-aggressive political friction into transparent public process problems. Transparency was their weapon. They survived the 4 to 8 month valley because the transparency infrastructure prevented them from being quietly isolated and absorbed in the dark. They made the dysfunction public, which forced the system to respond.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, because transparency without the structural authority to act on what you uncover often just leads to documented paralysis. Yes, 18F illuminated the roadblocks, but illumination alone doesn't rewrite the code. What happens when the legacy manager just says, I don't care if it's red on the dashboard, I'm not doing it because my performance review doesn't require me to?
Well, the political pressure usually forces their hand long before that.
Sometimes. But you're arguing that 18F survived through transparency. Transparency only keeps you alive for so long. Eventually, the legacy system stops caring that it looks bad and just absorbs you anyway. Which brings us to a critical pivot in this debate.
Okay.
Surviving the first year is one thing, but how do we permanently cure the system? How does an organization embed this change capacity so the absorption cycle doesn't just restart the moment this particular change agent leaves?
Because if you don't embed it, you just revert to the mean. The rhetoric-reality gap opens right back up.
Precisely. And this is why I argue that long-term, you can't just illuminate the hierarchy. You have to shatter it entirely.
Shatter it.
Yes, shatter it. The traditional corporate hierarchy itself is the mechanism of absorption. Think about how an idea dies in a legacy company. It has to pass the brand manager, then the regional VP, then the finance committee. It concentrates decisional authority at senior levels, meaning a change agent has to navigate multiple approval layers.
Right, the gauntlet.
The gauntlet, and at literally any one of those layers, a conventional executive can apply the brakes and kill the reform. If you want permanent transformation, you must distribute leadership authority structurally. You have to decentralize.
So you're talking about removing the veto power?
I'm talking about physically deleting it from the org chart. Look at Hire. They implemented the Rendon-Hay model,
Okay, yeah.
which is arguably the most radical structural intervention in modern business. They literally broke a global appliance manufacturing giant into thousands of autonomous microenterprises.
It is an incredibly extreme architectural intervention.
Extreme, but profoundly effective. Let me explain how it works practically. They eliminated traditional career hierarchies and the multiple approval layers. A microenterprise at Hire is a small team, say 10 or 15 people, and they have their own profit and loss statement.
Right.
If they want to build a refrigerator with a built-in tablet, they don't have to persuade 5 layers of middle management. They don't need a VP signature. They just build it, market it, and if it sells, they share in the profit. By breaking the hierarchy, Hire destroyed the very absorption pathways that normally crush change agents. By changing the physical architecture, they completely bypass the political attrition that you argue is so central to the problem.
I see the elegance in that, I really do. But I come at it from a different way, because dismantling an entire corporate hierarchy into thousands of micro-enterprises is an extreme, frankly, unrealistic prescription for the vast majority of legacy organizations. You cannot simply shatter a highly regulated retail bank into autonomous micro-enterprises and expect it to survive compliance laws.
So how do you embed change in a bank if you can't restructure it?
You don't need to shatter the structure. If you evolve the psychological contract and build distributed human capabilities. Take DBS Bank under Piyush Gupta. They executed one of the most successful digital transformations in the financial sector. They didn't blow up the corporate hierarchy. They couldn't. Instead, they built a digital evangelist program.
Which sounds suspiciously like strategy theater.
It would be if it were just a title. But they paired it with deep capability building. They systematically rotated traditional legacy bankers into technology roles and vice versa. They actively taught change literacy to middle managers. They targeted the exact people who typically act as the organization's immune system, and they gave them the network and the vocabulary to understand the disruption.
But Piyush Gupta is the CEO. They only did that because the chief executive structurally mandated and funded those programs.
Yes, leadership support is required, of course. But the locus of the intervention was capability building, not architectural demolition. The day-to-day mechanism was human empathy and network building, not ripping up the P&L. And if you combine that capability building with an evolution of the psychological contract, it is incredibly potent.
Explain what you mean by the psychological contract in this context.
It's the unwritten set of expectations between the employee and the employer. Look at Patagonia. Their psychological contract explicitly values environmental mission advancement over institutional loyalty. They actually view it as a success if a great employee leaves the company to go join an environmental nonprofit.
Wow.
Yeah, they've built a culture where the mission supersedes the preservation of the corporate structure itself. By aligning human purpose and distributed capability, you create an institutional counterweight that is vastly more powerful and more adaptable than just decentralizing the architecture. A structural microenterprise can still eventually be absorbed by market norms, but a deeply embedded, mission-driven network resists absorption organically.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. I'd argue Patagonia's psychological contract actually proves my point. It works because it is embedded in their structural architecture.
How so?
Well, their recruiting architecture screens for it. Their performance architecture rewards it. Their resource allocation funds it. The mission over loyalty dynamic isn't just a relational feeling circulating in the hallways. It is a structural reality of how they operate the business, from the top down. But I think we are circling a fascinating tension here.
We really are. It is the tension between the machine and the ghost in the machine.
Exactly. Let's summarize our positions in light of this discussion. My stance remains that institutional gravity, the pure structural weight of legacy operations, is simply too heavy for any individual or informal network to resist long-term without architectural interventions.
Right.
If an organization genuinely wants to counteract institutional absorption, it must change the hard systems. You need dedicated transformation budgets to survive the implementation valley. You need distributed leadership governance to remove the veto power of middle management. And most importantly, you need rigorous reward realignment that financially and structurally penalizes the status quo.
And my summary is that while those architectural changes might be the ideal end state, they are incredibly slow, taking years to implement, and are often politically impossible for a newly arrived change agent to enact. The absolute requirement for navigating the present and ultimately bridging those structures is relational strategy.
Yeah.
Change agents must accumulate political capital. They must leverage transparency and psychological safety to make resistance visible without triggering a fatal backlash. And they must evolve the capabilities and psychological contracts of the people around them. Without the human network, the structural architecture is just an empty building.
Yet, despite our different angles of approach, we share some very significant points of convergence here. We absolutely agree that technical merit alone is entirely insufficient for sustaining reform. A brilliant idea, unsupported by either structural resources or political coalitions, will be absorbed with terrifying speed.
Completely agree. The best idea does not win just by virtue of being the best idea. And we both recognize the profound danger of the rhetoric-reality gap, that dangerous illusion of progress, where organizations engage in strategy theater while quietly maintaining the exact same legacy systems that guarantee nothing will actually change.
Where we continue to diverge is the primary locus of intervention. When the immune system attacks, where do you start? I believe leaders must first re-engineer the organizational machine, so the budgets, the reporting lines, the compensation frameworks, to create an environment where the human network is actually allowed to thrive.
And I believe you must first empower that human network, building the coalitions, establishing psychological safety to generate the political leverage required to ever successfully re-engineer the machine in the first place.
It is a classic chicken and egg dilemma, but applied to multi-million-dollar organizational transformations. Understanding both the architectural forces and the human political realities provides a profoundly deeper appreciation of why organizational transformation is so complex and why the failure rate of change agents is so tragically high.
It really does. It reframes the failure of a change agent. It's not a personal deficit or a lack of charisma or a bad work ethic. It is a predictable mechanical collision with deeply entrenched systemic forces.
For our listeners, Dr. Westover's source material offers a wealth of additional examples of these dynamics. We've only scratched the surface today, but his text details how both structural and relational levers are pulled in real-world scenarios, from manufacturing floors to digital startups. We highly recommend exploring those case studies further.
The dynamics we've discussed are universally applicable, whether you are trying to innovate in a 3-person startup or trying to reform a massive federal agency. The forces of gravity are the same.
Which brings us right back to where we started. The brilliant surgeon, the sharp scalpel, and the perfectly healthy organ ready to be transplanted into a failing system.
The organization knows it needs the transplant to survive. It literally asks for the surgery.
But unless you change the underlying environment, whether through the hard architecture of immunosuppressants or the relational adaptation of the body itself, the immune system will always win. The foreign object will be neutralized, absorbed, and the system will remain perfectly, comfortably, and fatally unchanged.